Deputy Burton.
Thank you, and again I welcome the Council in here today, and I'm interested in some of the points you made there. First of all, the meeting is taking place today in the context that at lunchtime or before lunchtime the Minister has confirmed that there will be no cuts in relation to income tax in respect of workers and earnings. So I would imagine that logically that allows a certain amount of, if you like, drag in the context that incomes are going to go up. There will be no additional tax cuts, so there will be no cost there. So do you have a calculation roughly in your head of what that is likely to mean in terms of potential buoyancy?
Yeah, so that's built into the figure. So when we talk about the net 2.8 billion, we do consider non-indexation to be a revenue-raising measure. As you say, incomes are rising. If you don't change the credits and the bands, a higher share of people's income will be taxed at a higher rate. Essentially, it's an increase in their effective tax rate. And for 2020, we're looking at a figure of around 600 million of that. And that's included already in the 2.8. That is considered a revenue increase. So the fact that the Minister has announced no changes in income tax doesn't mean there's anything additional there. It's something that we would already consider as being something that would bring in additional revenue.
So you think about the 600 million?
600 million.
Yeah. No. An earlier estimate I heard was 400 million, but I think because of what you just said about immigration, earnings, and obviously PRSI is incredibly strong this year. So that brings me to my second question, which is the pensioners' bonus safe? In other words, it's a really important thing for pensioners on fixed incomes. They don't, by and large, have an opportunity to earn extra income. You know yourself, even for people who have savings, interest is at an all-time low. So the Christmas bonus is quite an important stimulus, particularly into a lot of rural Ireland in the weeks before Christmas in terms of spending. So, you know, can we get your collective opinion that it seems to be safe for the moment?
So as my colleague Martina said earlier, this is something that is predictable, and in fact there have been commitments from at least two ministers, I think the Minister for Finance and the Minister for Social Protection, that the payment would be made again in 2019. And our view is that if something is as predictable as this payment, and if a commitment has been made to make it, it should be included in the figures. So we've no indication that it is, as you say, at risk. Our concern would be that we want credible plans set out, and if this payment is to form part of government spending, it should be included in those plans.
Yeah, and I share that view, and I've shared that view over a long period of time. And I do think you have a point when you say there are certain things that should be reflected in the accounts, like the Christmas bonus, because certainly it was abolished by Fianna Fáil as its first measure, its first cut. And to be honest, it was pretty shocking, and there was a lot of difficulty in trying to reinstate it. But I do think it's kind of a positive payment in our system. The second question I want to ask about is the fact that there are to be no tax cuts for people at work in terms of personal taxation. Does that not make a much stronger case for Ireland to have a minimum effective corporation tax? Both because that would give, you have stressed correctly, I agree with you, the uncertainty of the corporation tax flows. And it's really, ridiculous that we don't even have a minimum effective rate of even, say, 2 or 3%, which would actually give some stability. Now, you may argue, and I know others argue, that that would result in a flight, potentially, of businesses from Ireland. But because the EU and the United States are now saying, given the state of various economies, that they should actually have contributions in different ways from companies, would you agree that there should be the Department of Finance very adverse to this, but would you consider that there is now a serious case to do that as a way of stabilising some of the corporation tax receipts?
This is something that the Fiscal Council doesn't have a view on, but if I take off my Fiscal Council hat and look at some of the work done on corporation tax, I suppose for 2018 we collected just over €10 billion. And if the effective tax on profits to generate €10 billion was in the order of 2%, you're looking at somewhere around 500 billion in profits, which I know the numbers in Ireland are big, but they're not going of that scale. To collect €10 billion at a 12.5% rate, even a 10% rate, requires profits in the region of 90 to 100 billion, which are pretty substantial. Now, there was one measure introduced maybe to try and reduce the potential volatility of our corporation tax back in October 2017, when the 80% cap was restored for capital allowance claims under Section 291A, and that will offer some reduction in volatility in corporation tax, but the amounts themselves are quite large. And I think we could introduce an effective rate of 2 to 3%, but I think the amount of additional revenue that would generate would be zero, because for profits earned in Ireland, the effective rate is substantially higher than that. And there are two reasons why companies have lower rates. The CNAG did an excellent report on the effective tax rates on the top 100 companies. And the two reasons why certain companies had lower rates were: one, they availed of the R&D tax credit, so maybe we could introduce limitations on the extent to which that can be used, or two, a significant source of their revenue was foreign revenue, that it was income earned abroad, and that they then paid a dividend back into Ireland, and that was counted as part of their taxable revenue. But because they'd already tax paid abroad, they didn't owe any additional tax here. So from an Irish perspective, they had a profit with very little Irish tax being paid, but that was because the tax was paid elsewhere. And I think we could remove those profits from our tax base, and that would see the effective tax rate rise, because you're just looking at Irish tax on Irish profits. But I think the volatility of corporation tax is an issue. One measure has been introduced to address it, and maybe others could. And that's not to say that the issue of an effective minimum corporate tax rate isn't important. It is hugely on the agenda at OECD level. And it's possible that in the context of the OECD, a minimum effective tax rate could be a threat for Ireland. But that depends on whether it's done on a country-by-country basis, which would be significant for Ireland, or whether it's done on a global basis. And I think we'd far prefer to see it done on a global basis.
Yeah, but you're talking about the stability of corporation tax, and in any event, we're in the last chance saloon on some of the taxation measures that we have. So I think sooner rather than later, and certainly in terms of the OECD process, I think it would make sense to actually show, as we have done in other areas, every year we have taken some measures in relation to corporation tax to actually indicate that we're not, as it were, and don't want to be the tax haven that others portray us as, because I think politically it's incredibly damaging to Ireland, and down the road a day will come when the balance of inward investment will be heavily affected by the tax claim.
Thank you. Deputy Burton, you wanted to come back in.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, I'd like to take up the issue of Brexit and the border. And Deputy Brannock, of course, is very much an expert on that, but I have my own connections to the area as well. I know you've no direct brief in relation to Brexit, but it seems to me and to many others with a knowledge of the border that the biggest problem is going to be smuggling, and that we could be faced with a 50-mile or even a 100-mile zone on either side of the border, where in fact there would be a lot of potential loss to the exchequer here in relation to VAT, because of goods being moved without being, if you like, recorded for tax purposes. And in the north, you could have, a comparative reaction. And I think that's an enormous concern to traders and legitimate businesses all along the border, because other people, will be going through. So have you commissioned anyone to try and model what likely hard Brexit impacts are going to be. Because while down the road, I think there's a big role for, trusted traders and all that kind of stuff. Anybody will tell you there's already a lot of smuggling along the border to the detriment of traders. And have you had any conversations about this? Because the potential risk loss to the revenue, particularly in areas like VAT and other directly levied taxes, whether on fuel or on other elements of trade, could be, in my view, very extensive and very damaging to the government's revenue capacity north and south.
So no, it's not something we have looked at or maybe even seen estimates of, and I think the risks of such evasion, illegal activity taking place are probably present regardless of whether Brexit happens or not, if it comes to the washing of marked gas oil and other outright tax evasion activities that can be undertaken, given perhaps the different rates between the two jurisdictions. I think a point raised earlier by Deputy Brannock would be just going round to what we might consider more traditional avoidance, that if the tax is lower in another jurisdiction, you go and buy your fuel there. There mightn't necessarily be anything illegal about that, but it would raise a concern about differences in the price levels. That's not something we've considered, it's not something I've seen information on, but when it comes, I think, to the setting of rates for excise and other issues, it's likely to be a factor, and you'd hope there would be a form of cooperation between the two jurisdictions on a matter such as that. I know cooperation is probably not at its strongest in recent times, but hopefully once we get through the process of leaving the European Union for the UK, that such cooperation like that can be restored. But I think you're correct. It is an issue, but it's not something that either we have undertaken or seen work undertaken on.
And secondly, I just wanted to ask you in relation to health. At this point, do you have a ballpark figure in mind of the likely deficit on the health side by the end of the year in terms of putting in an additional supplementary estimate? Is it 200 million, 300 million?
So we don't have a precise figure for 2019, as my colleague Michael has said. Indications from the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform earlier in the year were for a potential of around 150 million. We haven't seen anything to indicate that their concerns and our concerns are primarily those as raised by the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform for an amount of 150 million. The average we've seen for the last number of years has been around 500 million, with most of that arising in the final quarter of the year. So if you look at health spending now, it's on profile or on track. But there does somewhat seem to be an unusual profile pattern, as Michael has said, for the end of the year, with a dramatic slowdown in the growth of health spending forecasts. Now that might materialise, but it does look unusual, and it does suggest there is the possibility of an overrun again for 2019. We're not putting a figure on it. We have the indications from the Department of Public Expenditure and the average over the last number of years, which do indicate that it could be quite significant.
But this year already, they have given quite an amount of additional spending to health. So I assume that that's gone into the base. So all of the things being equal, the actual overrun by the end of the year should be relatively smaller? Yeah,
it would be a deep concern if there was to be a significant overrun again this year in line with previous years. The planned amount of spending for 2018 was 15.3 billion. The planned amount of spending for this year is 17.1 billion. So that's an increase in terms of what was originally set out for 2018 of 1.8 billion to what's now set out. Some of that was last year's overrun of 600 million, and there was an additional 1.1 million allocated for 2019. So in the context of such a large amount of additional resources, if there is a significant overrun, I think the concerns we've raised about health would have to be increased if those increases weren't sufficient to keep the health spending within its budget.
So is there likely to be a repeat of finding a lot of money down the back of the sofa?
So One issue
Like
is
last
that
year and previous year.
you could see an outperformance of corporation tax again mask these spending increases. So corporation tax has performed strongly in the early part of the year. There could be strong receipts in November, where it appears that these overruns in spending are being covered. But again, spending on health is something we should do on a consistent, sustainable and ongoing basis, and not have it dependent on these unreliable and possibly temporary corporation tax receipts.
Does the Fiscal Advisory Council have any advice to the Dáil, to government, as to how spending, extra spending in terms of a very difficult Brexit should be targeted? I noted from talking to people in Germany that during the last crisis, they spent a lot of money on directly subsidising employers to retain employees. Now, I noticed everybody referenced 3 or 4 times that there was a lot of expected potential unemployment, which would mean people obviously in our system shifting to social welfare. Do you see scope perhaps for us using the German system? Now, I know you can say it's underemployment and so on and underactivity, but they did a lot better. And they also consistently, I think, have done a lot better in the old East Germany, which isn't as dynamic economically as the old West Germany, to actually try and maintain firms rather than, as it were, crash them by an appropriate use of subsidies which would have to go to maintain people in employment.
That's something that the Fiscal Council wouldn't have a view on. We do see Brexit as bringing about the potential for additional spending, but whether that happens through the system of social welfare or whether that happens through a system of employment supports is a matter for the political process to decide. We just be more concerned with what the outcome is in terms of the overall public finances. We don't have a view on how those supports, if they are to be offered, are provided.
Okay, thank you.
Now,